The first reports came from the Outer Rim territories, entire star systems going dark in the span of hours. No distress signals, no survivors, just empty space where thriving worlds had existed for thousands of years. Captain Hyok Ryu of the patrol ship Morning Star was among the first to witness what the galaxy would soon fear. His vessel dropped out of hyperspace at the Kepler 442 system, expecting to find the usual mining colonies and trade stations. Instead, he found nothing. The planets were gone, not destroyed, simply gone as if they had never existed. Where a yellow sun had burned for billions of years, only a dim red dwarf remained, drained of most of its energy. "Sir," his communications. Officer Minji Han whispered, her face pale as moonlight. "I'm picking up movement on long-range sensors. Something massive. Multiple contacts." The bioships appeared on their screens like nightmares given form, living metal that pulsed with veins of light, each vessel the size of a city. They moved in perfect formation, a hive mind controlling thousands of entities as one. The lead ship turned toward the Morning Star, and Hyuk felt a chill run down his spine. The alien craft didn't just look alive, it looked hungry. "Get us out of here," he ordered, but it was too late. A beam of pure energy lashed out from the bioship, not to destroy but to drain. The Morning Star's power systems flickered as something pulled at their very essence. Hull plating began to dissolve, metal flowing through space toward the alien vessel like liquid. Hyok watched in horror as his ship was consumed, atom by atom, while the bioship grew visibly larger. They barely escaped with the emergency jump, but the message was clear. These weren't conquerors. They were harvesters, and they fed on everything. The Grand Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos. Representatives from 200 species filled the massive chamber, their voices creating a symphony of panic in dozens of languages. Holographic displays showed the advancing threat, red zones spreading across star maps like a disease. Each red zone marked a system that had been completely consumed. The Krathan delegation dominated the center of the hall, their warrior caste. Representatives standing nearly 3 meters tall, covered in ceremonial battle armor that gleamed under the artificial lights. Admiral Corex Thane, scarred from 100 battles, slammed his massive fist on the speaking podium. The sound echoed like thunder. 10,000 warships, he roared, his voice carrying the authority of a species that had never known defeat. The Krathan Armada will meet these invaders with blade and plasma. Our dreadnoughts have crushed empires. Our warriors know no fear. The assembled delegates murmured approval. The Krathan military was legendary throughout the galaxy. Their ships were floating fortresses, armed with weapons that could crack planets. If anyone could stop this threat through pure force, it would be them. Next came the Nexari, their synthetic forms gleaming with polished chrome and glowing circuits. Their representative, designated Unit Prime 7749, spoke through harmonic frequencies that the hall's translators converted to speech. 50,000 automated defense platforms await deployment, the machine being announced. Our war minds calculate optimal defensive formations. Our technology adapts faster than biological reflexes. Logic will triumph where emotion fails. The Nexari had turned warfare into a science. Their robotic fleets moved with mechanical precision. Each unit connected to a vast network that shared information instantly. They fought like a single massive organism, but one made of steel and circuitry rather than flesh. The ethereal ambassador materialized last, a shimmering projection of pure energy that hurt to look at directly. When the psychic being spoke, their words appeared directly in the minds of every being present, bypassing language entirely. 5,000 mind-linked vessels stand ready, the projection communicated, its form shifting like aurora in a solar wind. Our consciousness spans galaxies. Our thoughts move faster than light itself. Mental force shall shatter these creatures' unity. The ethereals were beings of pure thought, their physical forms long abandoned. They commanded ships through telepathic links, turning entire fleets into extensions of their collective will. Their psychic powers could crush minds or turn enemies against each other with a thought. As the three great powers finished their declarations, all eyes turned to the human section. Earth was still considered a minor player in galactic politics. their species having only achieved faster-than-light travel a few centuries ago. Most expected them to pledge a few dozen ships, maybe 100 at most. Nara Kim rose from her seat with quiet dignity. She was small compared to the alien representatives. Around her, wearing a simple blue uniform without decoration or ceremony. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her eyes held a calmness that seemed out of place amid the surrounding chaos. The hall gradually fell silent as delegates realized the human representative was about to speak. Some leaned forward with curiosity. Others barely paid attention, expecting a token gesture from a species they considered barely more advanced than the primitive worlds they'd left behind. "Earth will send one ship," Nara said, her voice clear and steady. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Then the hall exploded. Delegates leaped to their feet, shouting in outrage. The Krathan admiral's scarred face turned purple with anger. "One ship," he bellowed. "You mock this assembly with such cowardice." The Nexari representative's optical sensors flashed red. Mathematical analysis indicates human commitment insufficient for meaningful contribution to defensive operations. Even the ethereal projection flickered with what might have been discussed. "Your species abandons the galaxy in its hour of greatest need." Accusations flew like weapons. Some called humanity selfish. Others suggested they were too primitive to understand the scale of the threat. Save few demanded that Earth be expelled from the Galactic Alliance entirely for this insult. Through it all, Nara Kim stood motionless, waiting. She didn't argue. She didn't defend her species' decision. She simply waited for the storm of anger to pass. When the shouting finally died down to angry mutters, she spoke again. 2 words that would echo through galactic history. "One ship." Then she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving behind a hall full of aliens convinced that humanity had just sealed the galaxy's doom. Across the galaxy, war machines stirred to life with the thunder of 1,000 worlds mobilizing for battle. On Krathan Prime, massive shipyards that stretched across entire continents roared with activity. Foundries that had built weapons for 1,000 years worked day and night, pouring molten metal into the hulls of dreadnoughts. Each Krathan warship was a floating fortress, bristling with plasma cannons and missile tubes. Their hulls were thick enough to withstand planetary bombardments, their shields powerful enough to deflect asteroid impacts. Admiral Corex Thane stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Blood of Heroes, watching as 9,999 other warships formed up around him. Each vessel carried a crew of elite warriors who had trained their entire lives for moments like this. The sight was magnificent, a wall of steel and fire that had conquered half the galaxy. "Human vessel," Thane spoke into his communicator with barely concealed contempt. "You may follow behind our rear guard. Try not to get in the way when real warriors fight." Meanwhile, in the synthetic world factories of the Nexari Collective, assembly lines that never stopped working kicked into overdrive. Robotic arms moved with perfect precision, crafting 50,000 automated defense platforms in perfect formation. Each drone was connected to the others through quantum links, sharing targeting data and tactical information at the speed of light. They moved like a school of metal fish, each one knowing exactly where the others would be at any moment. Unit Prime 7749 calculated battle probabilities while observing the human ship's specifications. The data was disappointing. Standard hull, thickness, basic defensive systems, weapon loadouts that seemed almost primitive compared to Nexari standards. Human inefficiency noted, the synthetic being recorded in its databanks. Recommend minimal tactical importance assigned to single vessel contribution. In the deep void between stars, the ethereal fleet gathered like ghosts made of starlight. Their ships were works of art as much as war machines, crystalline structures that sang with psychic energy, crewed by beings who had transcended physical form centuries ago. Each vessel was an extension of the collective consciousness that controlled it, capable of maneuvers that would be impossible for any pilot with a physical body. The ethereal high mind touched the consciousness of every being in their fleet simultaneously, sharing the dismissive thoughts they held toward humanity's pathetic contribution. One ship against the might of the galaxy's greatest threat. It was almost insulting. But while these mighty armadas prepared with ceremony and grandeur, something very different was happening in Earth's solar system. Lunar Station hung in space like a steel flower, its arms extending toward the stars. No crowds gathered to watch the launch. No speeches echoed through communication channels. The UES Prometheus simply detached from its docking bay and drifted into the darkness, its engines barely glowing as it began its journey. To any observer, it looked ordinary. The hull was standard Durasteel plating, the same material used in civilian cargo haulers. Its engines were efficient but not exceptional. Its weapon systems appeared basic. A few defensive turrets and missile pods that wouldn't look out of place on a patrol ship. Everything about it seemed designed to avoid attention. Commander Ji-won Park walked the corridors of his ship with quiet confidence. He had served in Earth's deep space fleet for 20 years, commanding missions that took him to the edges of known space. His crew trusted him completely, which was essential for what they were about to attempt. Lieutenant Hannah Lee met him in the ship's command center, her tablet glowing with incoming messages. "Sir, we're getting communications from all 3 alien fleets. The Krathen want to know our weapon specifications. The Nexari are requesting tactical data-sharing protocols. The Ethereals—" She paused, looking puzzled. "The Ethereals tried to scan our minds for battle plans." Ji-won nodded calmly. Standard responses to all of them, polite but minimal information. The Krathen Admiral sent another message, Hannah continued, scrolling through her display. "He's asking if we need an escort to the rear guard position. He says human ships shouldn't be anywhere near the front lines where real fighting happens." A small smile played at the corners of Ji-won's mouth. "Tell Admiral Thane that we appreciate his concern, but we'll manage just fine on our own." As Hannah typed the response, she couldn't help but ask, "Sir, do you think they suspect what we're really carrying?" Ji-won glanced toward the sealed blast doors that led to the ship's most secure section. "They're so focused on weapons and armor that they can't imagine any other kind of warfare. That's going to be their weakness." Deep in the Prometheus belly, behind layers of security that would make a bank vault jealous, something extraordinary hummed to life. Row after row of quantum processors filled chambers the size of aircraft hangars. Each processor was more advanced than anything the other species had ever built, capable of calculations that would make the Nexari collective pause in wonder. But the processors weren't the ship's real secret. That honor belonged to the massive storage arrays that stretched through the ship's core like a digital spine. Petabytes of information flowed through crystalline matrices, each one containing something more precious than any weapon. Engineer Kyung-ho Shin monitored the startup sequence from his control station, watching as system after system came online. "Broadcasting arrays are at full power, Commander," he reported over the intercom. "We can reach every corner of this star system and probably the next 3 systems over." "Cultural database integrity check complete," added Dr. Soo-jin Lim from her station in the ship's archive center. "All files confirmed and ready for transmission. Music, literature, art, philosophy, everything humanity has ever created or dreamed. The alien fleets saw weapons where none existed. They expected armor where there was only determination. They looked for traditional military strength and found something they couldn't understand, the greatest weapon humanity had ever developed. Hidden in plain sight, Chief Communications Officer Min-ho Kang ran final tests on equipment that looked like standard military hardware but served a very different purpose. "Transmission systems optimal, sir. When the time comes, we'll be able to broadcast to every ship in the enemy fleet simultaneously." Ji-won stood in the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers who understood their mission completely. They weren't going to fight the Zephyrians with plasma cannons or missile barrages. They weren't going to match them shield for shield or armor for armor. They were going to do something far more dangerous. They were going to be human. The Prometheus accelerated toward the outer rim, leaving Earth's solar system behind. In a few days, they would meet the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. The aliens expected them to die quickly and quietly, clearing the way for real warriors to fight. They had no idea what was coming. The Helios Nebula stretched across space like a purple and gold tapestry, its swirling gases hiding deadly beauty. It was here that 65,000 ships from across the galaxy formed the largest battle formation in recorded history. The sight was magnificent and terrible, a wall of metal and energy that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Admiral Corex Thane stood on the bridge of the Blood of Heroes, watching his fleet deploy in perfect battle formation. 10,000 Krathan dreadnoughts formed the center line, their hulls gleaming with fresh armor plating. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a continent. Their plasma cannons could melt through asteroid belts. Their shields had never been broken in 1,000 years of conquest. "Today we write our names in the stars," Thane declared to his fleet. "For the glory of Krathan." The Nexari forces spread out in geometric precision around the flanks. 50,000 automated defense platforms moved like a school of metal fish, each one perfectly synchronized with the others. Their quantum computers calculated firing solutions faster than any biological mind could think. Their weapons systems adapted to any threat in real time. Above and below the main formation, the ethereal fleet hung like ghosts made of starlight. 5,000 crystalline ships pulsed with psychic energy, their crews existing as pure thought. They could strike at an enemy's mind directly, turning fleets against each other with telepathic commands. And far at the rear, almost forgotten, the human ship, Prometheus, held position like a lonely spectator to the greatest military gathering in galactic history. Then the Zephyrians arrived. They didn't announce themselves with fanfare or declarations of war. They simply appeared at the edge of sensor range like a disease spreading through space. The bioships were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Living metal that pulsed with veins of sickly light, each vessel seeming to breathe as it moved. Some were the size of cities, others no larger than fighters, but all moved with the same terrible purpose. Lieutenant Sungmin Kim at the sensor station of the Blood of Heroes could barely believe his readings. "Sir, I'm counting. It's impossible. There are millions of them. They just keep coming." The Zephyrian fleet spread across space like a plague, individual bioships merging and separating as if they were part of some vast organism. There was no formation, no strategy that the alien commanders could recognize. They moved like cells in a bloodstream, flowing around obstacles and reforming without any apparent communication. "All ships prepare for battle," Admiral Thane roared. "Fire at will." The first salvo lit up space like a newborn star. 10,000 plasma cannons fired simultaneously, sending streams of superheated energy toward the enemy fleet. The beams struck the leading bioships with enough force to vaporize mountains. The Zephyrians absorbed every shot. Where the plasma struck, the living metal seemed to drink in the energy, glowing brighter as it fed. The damaged bioships didn't explode or break apart. They grew. Sections that had been torn away by the plasma regenerated in seconds, growing back stronger than before. "Impossible," Thane whispered, watching his most powerful weapons make the enemy stronger. The Nexari response was swift and calculated. 50,000 missiles streaked toward the bioships, each one guided by quantum computers that could track a grain of sand in a meteor shower. They struck with perfect precision, explosions blooming across the enemy fleet like deadly flowers. Unit Prime 7749 watched the tactical display with growing confusion. The missiles had found their targets exactly as calculated, direct hits across multiple enemy vessels. But the explosions seemed to feed the bioships rather than damage them. Metal fragments from the destroyed missiles were being absorbed into the hulls, making them larger and more complex. Probability of enemy destruction decreasing, the synthetic being reported to its fleet. Weapons effectiveness negative. The ethereal fleet struck last, sending waves of pure thought toward the enemy. 5,000 minds linked together in perfect harmony, projecting psychic force that could shatter planets. They reached out to touch the consciousness of the bioships, seeking to turn them against each other, or simply shut down their minds entirely. The mental attack hit the Zephyrian hive mind like water hitting a mountain. The psychic force simply flowed around the collective consciousness without making any impact at all. Worse, the ethereals felt something terrible in that contact, a hunger so vast and alien that several of their number screamed and broke the mental link entirely. High Mind Keeper Veltar managed to maintain contact for only seconds before pulling back in horror. "They're not individuals," she broadcast to the fleet. "They're something else, something that thinks in ways we cannot comprehend." But the real nightmare was just beginning. The Zephyrian counterattack came without warning. Bioships that had been struck by plasma cannons now fired beams of the exact same energy back at the Crathan fleet. The weapons were perfect copies, down to the frequency modulation and targeting algorithms. But they were stronger now, enhanced by whatever alien intelligence controlled them. Crathan dreadnoughts that had survived 1,000 battles found their own weapons turned against them. Shields that had been designed to stop plasma fire were overwhelmed by plasma that had been improved beyond their parameters. Ship after ship exploded as their own technology was used to destroy them. The Nexari fared no better. Missiles that they had fired at the enemy came streaming back toward them, but they were different now. Faster, smarter. They dodged defensive fire that should have stopped them easily and struck with precision that exceeded Nexari calculations. There, learning. Unit Prime 7749 broadcast in what might have been fear. "Every weapon we use makes them stronger. They adapt faster than our systems can compensate." Captain Minho Choi commanded the Crathan cruiser Starhammer, watching in horror as his fleet was torn apart by their own weapons. Half the dreadnoughts were already gone, consumed by bioships that grew larger with every kill. The Nexari platforms were being systematically destroyed by improved versions of their own missiles. The ethereal fleet was in full retreat after their psychic attack had failed completely. In desperation, he opened communications to the one ship that hadn't joined the battle. "Human vessel, why aren't you engaging? We're being slaughtered. Every ship matters." The Prometheus floated calmly at the edge of the battlefield, its weapons silent while the greatest military force in galactic history died around it. Commander Ji-won Park stood on his bridge, watching the tactical displays with the calm focus of a scientist observing an experiment. "We're gathering data," Park replied, his voice steady despite the chaos filling the communication channels. "Data?" Captain Choi's voice cracked with desperation. "We need weapons, not analysis. They're killing us with our own guns." Around them, space filled with debris from destroyed ships. The bioships moved through the wreckage like scavengers, absorbing the metal and technology into their hulls. Each piece they consumed made them larger and more dangerous. "No," Commander Park said quietly, watching as another Crathan dreadnought exploded under fire from its own plasma cannons. "You need something else entirely." Lieutenant Hannah Lee looked up from her sensor station, her face pale but determined. "Sir, I'm reading massive energy fluctuations from the enemy fleet. They're not just copying our weapons, they're improving them. Each iteration is approximately 15% more effective than the last. How long until they've analyzed every weapon system in the Allied fleet?" Park asked. "At current learning rates, 17 minutes, she replied. Park nodded grimly. In 17 minutes, the Zephyrians would have perfect counters to every conventional weapon in the galaxy. The greatest military force ever assembled would be completely helpless. But that was exactly what humanity had been counting on. The final Nexari defense platform exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, its quantum processors unable to counter the improved weapons that the Zephyrians had stolen and perfected. Unit Prime 7749's consciousness flickered as the feedback from 50,000 destroyed drones overwhelmed its neural networks. The synthetic being's last coherent thought before shutting down was a calculation of total failure. High above the battlefield, the remaining ethereal ships began to scatter as their mind links cracked under the pressure of trying to comprehend. The alien hive consciousness. 3 ethereal minds had already been lost to madness after touching the vast hunger that drove the bioships. The others fled in terror, their crystalline vessels streaming away from an enemy they couldn't understand or fight. Admiral Corex Thane watched his mighty fleet die from the bridge of his crippled flagship. The blood of heroes had lost 3 of its 4 main engines, and half the crew was dead. Around him, the pride of the Crathan military burned in space, while bioships fed on their wreckage like metal vultures. In 2,000 years of warfare, he had never seen such complete defeat. "Human ship," he rasped into his communicator, his voice broken with despair. If you have any weapons at all, use them now. We're all going to die." The Prometheus hung, motionless at the edge of the battlefield, seemingly untouched by the carnage around it. Then, without warning, it began to move. But instead of charging toward the enemy with weapons blazing, it did something that made every surviving alien commander question their sanity. It positioned itself directly between the Zephyrian fleet and the retreating Allied forces, completely defenseless. Lieutenant Yuna Song sat at her cultural transmission station, her hands dancing over controls that looked like nothing any military officer had ever seen. Banks of quantum processors hummed around her, but they weren't calculating weapon trajectories or shield frequencies. They were preparing to broadcast something far more powerful than any plasma cannon. "Cultural database online," she reported to Commander Park. "All files confirmed and ready for transmission." "Sir, are you sure about this? We'll be completely exposed." Commander Park stood in the center of his bridge, watching the bioships reform their attack patterns. The alien vessels moved with perfect coordination, their living metal hulls pulsing. With absorbed energy from the destroyed Allied fleet, they had learned everything there was to know about conventional warfare. They were unstoppable. "Do it," Park ordered quietly. "Give them everything we've got." Yuna's fingers moved across her controls, and suddenly space itself seemed to come alive. The transmission burst from the Prometheus, like a shockwave of pure human spirit. It wasn't energy or matter. It was something far more fundamental. Thousands of years of human creativity poured into the void, racing toward the Zephyrian fleet. At the speed of light, Bach's mathematical perfection merged with Miles Davis's improvised chaos. Ancient cave paintings flowed alongside digital art that existed only in virtual space. Shakespeare's poetry mixed with modern rap lyrics. Philosophical works that contradicted each other completely played side by side with scientific theories that defied logic. The bioships closest to the Prometheus received the transmission first, and the effect was immediate and terrifying. The lead bioship, a massive creature the size of a space station, suddenly stopped moving. Its hull began to ripple and twist as the hive mind tried to process what it was receiving. The alien intelligence had evolved to absorb and understand consistent patterns of information. It could take any weapon, any technology, any logical system and improve upon it within minutes. But human creativity wasn't logical. Dr. Su Jin Lim monitored the transmission from her archive station, watching as petabytes of human culture streamed toward the enemy. "First wave delivered," she reported. "Classic literature, ancient music and traditional art forms. The bioships are... They're stuttering, sir." The massive bioship's movements became erratic. Its perfect formation began to waver as the hive mind encountered poetry that meant 6 different things at once. How could it process a haiku that said everything by saying nothing? How could it understand music that became more beautiful because it broke its own rules? "Second wave launching," Yuna announced. "Modern art, experimental music, and abstract philosophy." Picasso's cubist paintings hit the Zephyrian consciousness like hammer blows. Images that showed multiple perspectives simultaneously broke the aliens' linear thinking patterns. Jazz music that improvised beyond mathematical prediction sent processing loops spinning into chaos. Philosophy that questioned the nature of reality itself made the hive mind doubt its own existence. Engineer Kyung-ho Shin watched his power readings with amazement. "Sir, the transmission is drawing incredible amounts of energy, but the bioships, they're not adapting, they're not getting stronger." He was right. For the first time since the battle began, the Zephyrians weren't learning. They couldn't learn. Human creativity was too chaotic, too contradictory, too beautifully insane to be processed by minds that thought in perfect patterns. "Third wave," Yuna called out, her voice rising with excitement. "Comedies, paradoxes, and punk rock. This wave hit the bioships like a tsunami of impossibility. Stand-up comedians telling jokes that were funny because they made no sense. Logical. Paradoxes that proved true things were false and false things were true. Punk rock that celebrated rebellion for the sake of rebellion, including rebellion against itself." The massive bioship began to convulse, Its hull cracked and reformed in random patterns as the hive mind tried desperately to make sense of information that was designed to not make sense. Lesser bioships around it started spinning in place, their navigation systems confused by art that depicted maps of places that didn't exist. Captain Minho Choi watched from his damaged cruiser in complete bewilderment. "What are they doing to them?" he whispered. "Final wave launching," Yuna announced, and now her voice carried something that might have been joy. Everything else, all of it at once. The last transmission contained the full spectrum of human madness, religious texts that contradicted each other but were all considered sacred, scientific theories that worked in practice but were impossible in theory, love songs written to people who didn't exist, stories about heroes who were villains and villains who were heroes, movies that started at the end and ended at the beginning, paintings of colors that couldn't be seen, music written for instruments that hadn't been invented, philosophy that proved thinking was impossible while thinking about it. The effect on the Zephyrian fleet was catastrophic. Bioships began to break away from their formations, moving in random directions as their shared consciousness fragmented. The hive mind, which had operated as a single vast intelligence for millions of years, suddenly found itself thinking dozens of contradictory thoughts simultaneously. Some bioships tried to process human hip-hop and became trapped in infinite loops trying to understand rhyme schemes that deliberately broke their own patterns. Others encountered abstract expressionism and began reshaping themselves into impossible geometries that hurt to look at. The massive command ship at the center of the fleet started to glow with unstable energy as its core processors overheated. It had tried to absorb a human comedy routine about the meaninglessness of existence and couldn't determine whether the joke was funny because it was true or true because it was funny. Lieutenant Hannah Lee stared at her tactical display in amazement. "Sir, their formation is completely broken. Individual bioships are moving away from the fleet. Some of them they're flying in circles." "It's working," Engineer Kyung-ho breathed. "They can't process chaos. They can't adapt to something that doesn't follow rules." Commander Park watched as the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known began to tear itself apart, not from weapons or force, but from the simple impossibility of understanding why humans painted pictures of melting clocks or wrote poems about the sound of one hand clapping. "Keep broadcasting," he ordered. "Give them everything, every song, every story, every beautiful contradiction we've ever created." The Prometheus continued its transmission, while the Zephyrian fleet slowly came apart around it, unable to fight an enemy that made no sense at all. Space around the Helios Nebula looked like the aftermath of a cosmic storm. Debris from destroyed. Ships drifted in slowly expanding clouds, but something strange was happening to the Zephyrian bioships. Instead of the unified fleet that had terrorized the galaxy, individual creatures floated aimlessly through the void, no longer connected to their hive mind. Some bioships had transformed into bizarre shapes as they tried to process human art. One massive vessel had twisted itself into what looked like a giant sculpture, its living metal frozen in the middle of trying to understand a Dali painting. Another had sprouted random antenna arrays after encountering radio comedy shows, as if it was still trying to tune in to frequencies that made sense. The surviving bioships weren't threatening anymore. They moved like confused animals, each one following its own path through space. Some headed toward distant stars, others simply drifted, their alien minds overwhelmed by concepts they could never hope to understand. The galaxy's greatest threat had become thousands of lost individual creatures seeking meaning in a universe that suddenly seemed far too complicated. Captain Minho Choi floated in the emergency pod that had ejected from his destroyed cruiser, watching rescue ships approach through the nebula's swirling gases. His communicator crackled with voices from across the scattered fleet. Krathan survivors calling for medical assistance, Nexari units reporting system failures, ethereal minds trying to re-establish broken connections. When the human ship, Prometheus, appeared on his scope, still intact and undamaged, Choi could barely find his voice. "How?" he whispered into his communicator. "How did you do it?" The human vessel moved through the debris field like a gentle giant, its hull unmarked by battle. Rescue shuttles launched from its bays, heading toward life pods and damaged ships. Without regard for which species they belonged to, human crews worked alongside alien survivors, pulling them from wreckage and providing medical aid. Commander G1 Park stood on his bridge, watching the rescue operations with quiet satisfaction. Around him, his crew monitored the dispersing bioships to ensure they wouldn't regroup, but it was clear the threat was over. The individual creatures showed no sign of reconnecting or forming new collective patterns. "Sir," Lieutenant Hannah Lee reported from her station, "we're receiving communications from across the surviving fleet. They all want to know what we did." Park opened a channel to broadcast his response to every ship in the area. "We realized early that the Zephyrians were information-based entities. They consumed knowledge, processed it, and used it to grow stronger. You can't fight information with force, only with information they can't process." His words carried across space to damaged Krathan dreadnoughts, scattered Nexari platforms, and fleeing ethereal vessels. In the silence that followed, survivors struggled to understand how everything they knew about warfare had just been proven wrong. "While you brought your strengths to the battle," Park continued, "we brought ours. The Krathan brought military might, the Nexari brought technological precision, the Ethereals brought psychic power, all logical, all predictable, all easy for the enemy to understand and copy." Admiral Corex Thane, bleeding from a head wound in his flagship's damaged command center, managed to croak into his communicator. "But what did you bring? What weapon could do this?" Lieutenant Hannah Lee looked up from her console, a small smile on her face. "Human unpredictability, sir. Our greatest weapon has always been that we don't make sense, even to ourselves. We're the only species that creates art for no reason, tells jokes that aren't funny, and writes music that deliberately breaks its own rules." The ethereal ambassador, her psychic projection flickering weakly from one of the few surviving crystal ships, sent her thoughts directly to the human vessel. But one ship against an armada? How could chaos defeat order? Cultural Officer Yuna Song answered from her transmission station, surrounded by the quantum arrays that had saved the galaxy. "Sometimes, one right answer is worth more than 1,000 wrong ones. We didn't need to be stronger than them, we just needed to be more human." She gestured toward her screens, which still showed fragments of the cultural database that had broken the hive mind. "Every species in the galaxy tries to be logical, consistent, predictable. You build weapons that follow physics. You create strategies that make mathematical sense. You think in patterns that can be understood and copied." Engineer Kyung-Ho Shin added from his position, monitoring the ship's systems. "But humans, we paint pictures of impossible things. We write stories where the hero loses, and that's somehow a victory. We make music that sounds wrong, but feels right. We've spent thousands of years celebrating the fact that we contradict ourselves." The implications spread through the scattered fleet like ripples in a pond. Species that had built their entire civilizations on logic and consistency were confronted with the reality that sometimes chaos was the most powerful force in the universe. Dr. Sujin Lim spoke up from her archive station. "The Zephyrians evolved to process any consistent information pattern, but human culture isn't consistent. It's beautifully, impossibly contradictory. We're the only species that considers it normal to laugh at things that aren't funny and cry at stories we know aren't real." News of the victory spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Within hours, every world, every station, every outpost had heard the story of how humanity's single vessel had accomplished what 65,000 warships could not. Communication networks buzzed with discussions, debates, and attempts to understand the impossible victory. A new phrase entered common usage among the starfaring species: one human solution. It became shorthand for an answer so unexpected, so impossible to predict, that it solved problems no conventional approach could touch. Diplomats used it when negotiations succeeded through completely unconventional means. Scientists invoked it when research breakthroughs came from seemingly random directions. The phrase spread to every corner of galactic civilization, carried by traders, explorers, and refugees who had witnessed or heard about the battle. It became a symbol of hope for the impossible, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful solutions came from the most unlikely sources. As the Prometheus slowly turned away from the battlefield and set course for Earth, Commander Park walked through his ship, checking on his crew. They had saved the galaxy not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but by being exactly what they were, gloriously, chaotically, impossibly human. In his final log entry, recorded as the stars of home grew brighter ahead of them, Park wrote words that would be studied in military academies and philosophy schools across the galaxy for generations to come. Mission accomplished. Today we learned that sometimes being human is enough. Sometimes the greatest strength is not. Making sense. Sometimes one ship carrying the dreams, art, and beautiful contradictions of an entire species is worth more than all the weapons in the galaxy. We came here not as conquerors, but as humans, and that made all the difference. The Prometheus disappeared into hyperspace, carrying its crew home to a world that would wake up to find itself the most respected military power in galactic history, not for their weapons, but for their humanity. The end.